Good evening, everybody. My name is Lee Jones, and I'll be hosting the event this evening. And the event is Economic Policy After Brexit and COVID-19 Taking Control. So obviously, the economy has been a central part of the Brexit process. It was a central part of the arguments in the referendum, but the level of debate has been very poor, one might say. The arguments in the referendum were all about the costs and benefits of EU membership, the argument that Brexit would cost us £4,000 per household. And the discussions about Brexit since the referendum have been heavily centred around questions of trade, free trade and trade deals. And I think this is not really related to the reasons why people voted to leave. People didn't leave because they wanted to turn Britain into Singapore on Thames, as some people suggest. They voted to leave because they wanted to restore a sense of control in their lives. And so that's the subtitle of tonight's discussion, is taking control. How can we, what policies do we need to restore democratic control over the economy? And where do we go from here? What kind of policies do we need in the future to overcome the COVID crisis and to induce greater democratic control over our economy? Well, we're very fortunate to be joined by two fantastic panelists this evening. Speaking first will be Bill Mitchell, who will be known to many of you as a leading light of modern monetary theory. Bill is one of the listed supporters of the full Brexit, and along with another of our, well, one of our co-founders, in fact, Thomas Fatsey, wrote a fantastic book called Reclaiming the State in 2017. And then speaking after him will be Professor Costas Lapavitsas, one of the co-founders of the full Brexit and one of the members of the steering committee, who is the author of many books, but most recently and personally, The Left Case Against the EU. So they'll both speak for around 15 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for discussion. All attendees can raise questions, make comments using the Q&A function. If you'd like to put your comments and questions in there, the speakers will come to these at the end. Alternatively, if you prefer to make an oral intervention, you'll be able to do that after the discussions using the raise hand function, and I'll call on you. So without further ado, Bill, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Lee, and hello, everyone. Good morning, everybody. Good evening to you. This is one of these weird coronavirus events where I've spoken into Northern Hemisphere twice on the same day, with me speaking on 2 separate days in Australia. So I gave a talk in Switzerland last night before I went to sleep, and it was early morning in Zurich, and then we have this today. So thanks to Lee, and thanks to everybody who've taken the time to come and listen and participate and offer your views as well. And thanks to Costas, nice to see him. And thanks to the full Brexit group, who, were one of the stalwarts of the campaign, in my view, providing sensible information in a storm of misinformation. And the introductory comments that I'll make to motivate the discussion. First of all, the world has, what I see at the moment, 3 interrelated challenges. We've obviously got this health challenge, and where that's going is anybody's guess. I know where it's going in Australia. We've virtually suppressed the virus now through very disciplined and very tough lockdowns, particularly in my home state of Victoria. Even though I live in New South Wales, I still say my home state is Victoria. But we've suppressed the virus, and if we analyse the economic damage, it's less than many countries that didn't suppress the virus, and is now seeing the virus out of control. And I see, you know, Dr. Fauci, the American Chief Health Officer, yesterday saying that it's out of control in America now. It's a terrible situation, and I sense that in Europe as well, and Britain. And this is all policy folly in my view, but that's one of the challenges. The other challenge that's simmering below that, which is nonetheless important, is the climate challenge. We seem to have that's gone off the headlines at the moment, but I saw this morning when I first looked at the news that an area in the Arctic has not frozen for the first time. And these sort of little events that you see on a weekly or a daily or, you know, whatever basis are telling you that it hasn't gone away and there's a major problem for humanity and our globe. And of course, the other problem that I have struggled against all my career is mainstream economics. The dissonance that's now quite clear between the statements and the influence of mainstream economics and the outcomes and the veracity of the predictions and the outcomes, and it's widening, and it's dramatic, and it's extremely damaging to our societies and our well-being within those societies. If I did a report card on what we sort of loosely called the neoliberal period, which has been driven from a policy sense by my colleagues, my mainstream colleagues, it's a litany of abuse and disaster. And there's no easy way, no simple way of saying that. We, you know, in every of the key parameters that we would measure economic and social well-being, we've deteriorated dramatically over the last 3 decades as a consequence of this application of this particular way of doing economics. And the problem that, of course, we have is that the citizens feel it, but they don't understand it, and they've been lulled into a fictional world created by my colleagues, a world that serves the interests of the top end of town, as I call it, the elites, and captures the bottom end of town to do the dirty work and but not get the rewards. And you know, this is a major challenge. How the dissonance is quite clear. The citizens are not quite sure why it's happening, but they know that the system hasn't delivered on the promises that were made to them, that their well-being would rise. And I think the manifestations of that angst and anxiety are quite clear, and in all different ways. So the yellow vests in France, you know, the regional urban tension among citizens now, as that neoliberalism has created and accentuated. It was always there. They've accentuated it. It's accentuated it. The election of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote is a very clear example of this anti-establishment revolt that's going on. And you can see the dissonance in statements now from central bankers. You know, mainstream economics has pushed the burden of stabilisation policy, economic policy, macroeconomic policy onto monetary policy, and eschewed the use of discretionary fiscal policy, made it passive, biased towards surplus and austerity. And of course, we've now got these ridiculous monetary policy parameters, negative interest rates in Europe. And we've got balance sheets of central banks exploding through bond price purchases, all in this smokescreen fiction that they're just managing liquidity. But no, they're not. They're funding fiscal deficits, and with that type of monetary policy stance is pretty ineffective in its purpose of counter-stabilising, stimulating growth. Central banks have been trying to stimulate inflation for the last several years, using mainstream causalities on the assumption that they could do that. And I won't go into the technical details of that, but it's another one of these fictions. It's failed. They can't do it. And when you've got fiscal policy bias towards austerity, there's no way you're going to get a systematic inflation outbreak. And so even central bankers are starting to call for a return to fiscal dominance. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a very dramatic statement from the US Federal Reserve Board. Effectively, it wasn't expressed like this, but effectively they were abandoning the mainstream rhetoric and the narrative, the fictional world, the so-called Nehru world, that central banks had to be forward-looking in their monetary policy, their interest rate settings, and use unemployment as a policy tool to discipline inflation. And so if they expected inflation would increase a little bit in the next year or something, they would quickly try to increase unemployment to get ahead of it. That was that's been the mainstream monetary policy regime for a few decades. And they've now abandoned that and said that that's been very damaging for economic growth and for maximising employment, which they now admit is part of their charter. And they're now going to take a backward-looking position and try to push the economy and to increase and maximise employment and worry about inflation later if it becomes a reality, which of course it probably won't. And that's a dramatic. I read something in Reuters where they said that this statement from the Federal Reserve basically ends the mainstream economics narrative. So that's huge. And a third group that's sort of driving this dissonance is the financial markets, quite predictably, but they're taking political positions that they haven't taken before. And they're realising that mainstream economics is costing them money, is undermining their business model. The negative interest rates and the low yields on bonds, 10-year bonds are now going around the world at negative yields. That means that the bond investors are paying the government to lend them money. And in the not too distant future, and get this, Japan's often held out as a disaster because it's got 250% of gross public debt to GDP ratio, and all the bond markets are saying, worrying that there's going to be insolvency and all the rest of the nonsense that comes out of this fictional world. But not too distant future, and I underline this and put it in bold, the total interest burden of all of that Japanese government debt will turn negative. And that's because as they retire debt that had positive yields, they're issuing debt at negative yields. Total destruction of the mainstream narrative. And the financial markets are starting to back up against this. Their investment opportunities are falling. And the fiscal austerity showing up in poor rates of investment in public capital infrastructure is undermining their business model. So that's a huge challenge, and there's a huge dissonance. And what I've been arguing for some time now is that we definitely are in a paradigm shift in economics, and a paradigm shift hopefully for the better, but not necessarily, because paradigm shifts can be hijacked. And there's definitely an attempt to hijack it in the same way that Keynes's general theory in the 1930s was hijacked, backed by the neoclassical economists. But that's a process underway. And then for Britain, so they're global challenges. Then for Britain, we've got Brexit and the way that's being handled. And I think the introduction from Lee was excellent, that all of the narrative has shifted into trade, but trade's not the issue. It's the sovereignty of the nation state and how they use that capacity, which is immense. The legislative and regulative capacity of the British government is immense. And people who read my work will know that I've been a long-term supporter of Brexit and an anti-EU person, because I see the EU as and certainly the Eurozone within the EU as being the most the most sophisticated or extended expression of the neoliberal era. It's the neoliberalism is embedded within its very treaty, its very legal structure, and that's what Britain had to get out of. The neoliberalism is in the political structure of Britain, but it's not in the not necessarily in the treaty of the EU. It's very difficult to expunge that. But in the English neoliberalism, the British neoliberalism, sorry, that's a political issue. That's a debate, and people called me delusional when I was supporting the referendum yes. But I always said that the outcome would depend upon the political debate within Britain, and it could become a very negative outcome for Britain, but it could become a liberation. And I'm still hopeful that it will become a liberation, but I'm not so sure, because the political forces are not aligning very well. And that brings me to the last sort of thing I would say, is that one of the problems that we have as progressive voices is that there's an internecine warfare within the progressive side of the polity and the debate. And that played out in the Brexit debate quite clearly, where you had the urban voices in the progressive movement talking about, Remain, and this sort of globalist vision, this cosmopolitanism, which in the EU ends at its borders. It's not cosmopolitanism at all. The EU leaves people dying on its borders and drowning at sea and on beaches. And so we've got this real problem that there's a very wide split within the progressive movement. And I saw this morning that Jeremy Corbyn's been suspended from the Labor Party, for God's sake. And Chris Williamson, my friend in Britain, was expelled from the Labor Party, and things like that don't augur well for what we need to do. And what we need to do, in the final things I'm going to say by way of introduction, is that the only way forward is to create a true working class movement. The Brexit yes vote was an expression of the working class movement, and the Remain vote and advocacy from the progressive side of politics and the intellectual progressive side was a denunciation of that working class voice. And the working class, and I still believe in the concept of class struggle. It's central to all my thinking and my analysis. And unless we find a way in which we can bridge the gap between the elements within the working class, the more educated urban voices that have done fairly well out of globalization and that era, and the more industrial working class that has done very poorly as their job opportunities have collapsed, as austerity has taken away their services and destroying their communities. Unless we can bridge that gap in some way, well, then we're cooked. We won't be able to meet the challenges that I outlined. And so there's, you know, part of that is what we outlined in, Thomas and I outlined in Reclaim the State. We have to work towards renewing our understanding that the currency issuing state is powerful. Globalization hasn't undermined that, and you just have to see the way the Icelandic government defeated the hedge funds when it put the capital controls on to realize, and the courts who the hedge funds sought refuge in to get their money out, ratified the understanding that the legislative jurisdiction of the Icelandic state was all powerful, and the legislative jurisdiction of the British government is all powerful against global capital and the City of London. And when I've had meetings with key players in the British Labour Party and their advisors, for example, all I heard was, oh, the City of London would destroy us if we do some things. We've got to get over that. And one way of getting over it, and it's the last thing I'm going to say by way of introduction, is, and this relates to sort of my agenda and my mission, is that a key part of the progressive way forward is economics education. And of course, I'm one of the founders of modern monetary theory, and I see that as the emerging paradigm. It's the only body of work that really underpins this new fiscal dominance, that provides you with a good understanding of what the consequences of different policy choices are for a currency issuing government. Mainstream economics is dead and will provide us with no way forward. And so one of the key things that progressive people have to do, I think, as a way forward, is to learn macroeconomics. Spare the thought, but that's what I think. So I'll leave it there and hand over to Costas, and thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Bill, for that introduction. Over to Costas.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss these issues with Bill, with Lee, and with all participants, really. The topic is huge. I've only got 15 minutes. If Lee is being generous, I might get a few minutes more, but it won't stretch to that much. So I better get moving. One can talk about coronavirus at great length, discuss it for the periphery of Europe, discuss it for United States and China, discuss it for other parts of the world. But here I want to focus on the UK, because that's the brief, because that's where we are anyway. Now, I would make a statement at the beginning, and then I will substantiate it. This is an extraordinary crisis. Many people have used the term unprecedented, and it is unprecedented. The reason why I think it's unprecedented is that it is associated very closely with the nation state. This crisis has demonstrated that the nation state is enormously powerful at present. All that talk about markets overcoming the nation state shrinking to insignificance because of globalization, and so on, all that stuff that we've lived with for the last several decades have just been shown to be complete hogwash. The nation state at the moment is probably more powerful than it's been for a very long time. Arguably, it is as powerful now, probably more powerful than it has been at any time in the history of capitalism. At the same time, it has considerable weaknesses that have to do with class, but its power is phenomenal, and the crisis is associated with it. Now, the other thing about coronavirus is, of course, to a certain extent, the pandemic is an external shock. It's not a crisis that came from within the functioning of the capitalist economy. It came as an external shock. This shock hit an economy, in the case of the UK, but also more generally, that was actually weak. It had been weakened by the crisis of 2007, 2009, never really came out of that in any successful way. And the weakness you can see in terms of profitability, which never really recovered, investment, which remained weak, growth, which was appalling, intensified inequality across the country. It was already very unequal, and it became even worse. Intensified divisions among the regions, the north and the south, and so on. Altogether, a state of affairs in 2019 of weakened financialization and problematic recovery for 10 years. So that economy received a vast shock delivered by the state. The state, confronted with coronavirus, was unprepared, could not handle this, and imposed lockdowns. I'll come back to the lockdowns towards the end of the talk, but it imposed lockdowns, and of course, by imposing lockdowns, it demonstrated phenomenal power. They shut down enormous cities, countries, and so on. By doing so, they disrupted production, pushed unemployment up, and they delivered a blow to demand and income. It was a kind of stop imposed by the state on a weakened economy, a crisis that was catalyzed by state action when the economy was already weak. That's remarkable and unprecedented enough. What was even more remarkable was the response of the state to that, however. Once the magnitude of the crisis became clear, the response of the state can only be described as astonishing, because within a matter of days, powerful states, including the UK state, abandoned the shibboleths of decades in practice and adopted policies that a short while before would have been considered unthinkable. Now, what are these policies? Well, obviously monetary policy in the first instance. Part of that we'd seen before. Basically, the provision of vast amounts of liquidity by the central bank, by the Bank of England, driving the money supply up by 15% since the beginning of the crisis. There's been no increase of that magnitude that I can find in the data for decades. An incredible jump in liquidity provision by the central bank, and of course, driving the rate of interest even closer to zero, the official rate of interest even closer to zero. Zero interest capitalism. Now, we've seen, of course, that type of monetary policy previously, but to that extent, no. The magnitude of liquidity provision, the driving of interest rates down to incredibly low, even negative levels, no, we've seen nothing like that in this country and elsewhere, other developed countries across the world. So that's the first response by the state. Command over money, fiat money created by the central bank, allowed the state to intervene in this extraordinary way. Even more astounding than that, however, which to a certain extent we'd seen before, as I've already said, was fiscal policy. Suddenly, the UK state discovered fiscal policy, and it discovered that it could engage in fiscal policy, which involved extraordinary employment support, the furlough scheme, involved small business support, and involved support to avoid bankruptcy by a huge raft of organizations, corporations fundamentally. What did the state do, in other words? It nationalized the wage bill to a certain extent. It basically took the private wage bill into the books of the state. And it also nationalized the income statement. In other words, it basically prevented losses from being made by private enterprises across the country. Both of these go directly against neoliberalism in every possible way. To do that, the state obviously had to spend, and it had to increase its own debt, which it did enormously, and I will come back to that. By increasing its own debt, it also facilitated an increase in private debt. Debt during the last 8 months, private debt and public debt in this country has increased very, very greatly. And that is something that we need to consider. One thing the state did not do, however, as it adopted these extraordinary measures, was to nationalize equity, was to nationalize the corporations themselves, was actually to take productive assets into public ownership. There it stopped. It provided debt, it allowed companies to borrow, it gave them guarantees to borrow. At the moment, there is a huge number of enterprises in this country that are enormously indebted and are likely to survive, and I'll come back to that. But the state stopped at nationalizing the equity, taking them over. That is something we need to bear in mind and discuss. That aside, the intervention was extraordinary, as I've already explained. How do I understand this response? Obviously, it backs what I said originally. The power of the nation state at the moment is enormous, colossal, in its ability to intervene. All that stuff about the state not being able to intervene is just nonsense, as has been clearly demonstrated. The intervention of the state, however, was clearly to defend capitalism. There's nothing to do with defending workers' interests or defending society as a whole. It had to do with rescuing neoliberal financialized capitalism from the hole it found itself in because of the crisis. And that is obvious too in terms of the benefits drawn by the rich and by certain sections of big business because of these state policies that I've outlined. Liquidity provision, state support for the financial system has resulted in extraordinary wealth increases for the richest in this country and in other parts of the world. The already phenomenally rich have become even richer as a result of these policies the last few months. Benefits have also been drawn by a small number of hugely powerful monopolistic or oligopolistic information-related enterprises that have benefited from coronavirus and from the actions of the state, and that augurs badly for polity and for economy in the years to come. Now, I haven't got very much time. So I want to move on to what next? What can we do? What will happen next? Where are we? Today, the IMF has produced a report on the UK just today. It expects a recession of the order of 10% for 2020. It projects growth for next year about 5.7%, but it is highly skeptical as to whether it will materialize. It thinks that there's substantial weakness, and it believes that there are risks to unemployment and advocates, there you have it, sustained public intervention, fiscal policy, and increased debt by the UK state in order to prevent the worst from materializing this year and next. The IMF does that. The biggest voice of neoliberalism during the last few decades. So what can we expect from the left? What can we expect and what can we say from the left on this? What we can say is the state has, in a sense, shown the way. They've taken measures which have shown that neoliberalism doesn't have to be complied with. It is possible to follow a totally different path. It is possible to adopt measures that defend employment, that defend production, and that look after the well-being of working people in ways that hasn't happened so far. That, however, requires a coherent program, a series of steps that we as the left should be putting across. And in that respect, we haven't been very clever. We haven't been very good. We've been voiceless throughout this. My suggestion then is the following for what we should be saying. Priority number one is to intervene in the debate on health. Much of what will happen this country and next will depend on how coronavirus unfolds. In some parts of the world, it seems to have been placed under control. China, for instance. In Europe and in the UK, it's a different story. We're entering a second stage, a second wave that will affect the economy and it will affect society. From the perspective of the left, it seems to me the argument ought to be, we don't need a lockdown, certainly not a lockdown that will hit the poorest and the weakest and the working class of this country. We need a different policy. We need a policy that spends, invests, and catches the disease where it starts and protects the weakest through testing and primary healthcare. We know far better now that this disease hits the poor and the weak. We need to intervene in a targeted way to protect the poor and the weak. We don't need a generalized lockdown that will harm precisely the poor and the weak. That's point number one. Associated with that is, of course, the question of freedom and democracy, which Lee mentioned in his introduction, and which coronavirus has brought to the fore in unprecedented ways. The strength of the information technology companies, the Amazons and the Microsofts and so on, and the benefits they've drawn from coronavirus and the state intervention around it are unprecedented. That's a real threat to democratic practice in the years ahead. We need to be aware and we need to put forth arguments to stop this emerging union between incredibly powerful states and incredibly powerful monopolists with a global presence. And then we need arguments that are more specifically economic. In the UK, we need to consider seriously how to support people's income and their ability to spend and survive in the coming period. It's going to be tough for reasons that I've just explained, harsh, and we need extraordinary measures. This is an extraordinary crisis. It requires extraordinary measures. I have long been very skeptical of the idea of basic income for reasons that are well known among the left. I am less skeptical now. It seems to me that the policy of basic income to support the working class people, particularly during the pandemic, for a certain period of time, needs to be reconsidered by the left in this country. There are people who will go hungry in the months ahead. So a policy of basic income for the pandemic is something we need to consider seriously. It is perfectly feasible, perfectly doable. State expenditure to confront the crisis has demonstrated that it is possible to do it. When it comes to funding it, over the next 2 years, if we say we adopt it for 2 years, then reform, redistributive tax reform is necessary. This country needs redistribution. I'll come back to it. It should be funded through taxing the rich and taxing the rich appropriately to support the poor and the weak and the working class. Associated with that is, of course, protection of minimum wages, the minimum wage, which has come under pressure and which will come under increasing pressure in the times ahead as coronavirus continues to unfold. Still linked with that is, of course, schemes of public employment. We need urgently schemes of public employment because unemployment will become a problem in the months ahead. We need sustained programs of keeping people in employment for the next year or two. How to fund it? How to fund all these in the first instance? We know the capitalist state has already done it. The state should borrow. Public borrowing in the UK has now reached the level of just over 100% of GDP. It's high. It's a sustained increase. It's in line with what's been happening the last 10 years and then more, because the borrowing jumped the last few months. But it's not nearly as big as what we saw back in the Second World War, in the period after the war. There's a lot more scope for the state to borrow, and it costs very little. Interest rates are negative, moving into negative territory. There is plenty of scope for the state to borrow and sustain these interventions, which are absolutely necessary. That then is a package of economic measures that would look after the interests of workers and so on in the immediate period and deal with the crisis. But clearly, these are at best short-term measures, short-term reforms that would allow us to deal with the shock of the pandemic. What this country needs is evident from the weakness of the economy prior to the coronavirus shock. It needs, of course, a program of sustained intervention for development and for restructuring and rebalancing the economy. We had this debate in bits and pieces when Brexit was an issue. We were never allowed to have it properly, but it still surfaced. It's clear now what is necessary to do. We need a policy of intervention, and that will arise because, as I've already mentioned, a lot of enterprises in this country are heavily overborrowed. They won't be able to survive. Once the state withdraws part of its intervention, they won't be able to survive. Nationalization is necessary. It will arise. It will arise, taking over assets, productive assets, taking them over and managing them in a public-minded way. Public property is necessary then in production, and of course, public property in banking will need. We will need public banks in order to sustain the program that we need of restructuring the economy. On that basis, we can engage in rebalancing the UK economy in a geographical sense and in the sense of the balance between the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary sector. The UK needs to definancialize, and it needs to strengthen its industry and manufacturing. That will take an industrial strategy. There are plenty of ideas on how to do that. What it would take is state policy with working class support in order to bring it about. The last thing that should go with that is, of course, the policy of sustained redistribution. I've already mentioned it in the context of the possible policy of basic income. Whether basic income becomes a policy or not, the UK needs redistribution, and it needs it urgently. And that means taxing wealth, taxing income, and rebalancing the incredible inequalities that we've seen accumulate the last few decades. The time is now to propose these ideas because the left has been voiceless. The time is now. The time is to go out, discuss these things with working people. They're ready to listen. I know that politically, the moment is not the best, given what's been happening with the Labour Party and the rest of the left, but the time for putting new ideas is here. And if we don't do it, no one else will. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Costas. Thanks to you both for excellent introductions. So we've had lots of questions come in the Q&A box, which I'll try to group together and put to you both. And now you don't have to type your questions and comments into the Q&A box. You can raise your hand if you prefer to be called on, and I'll do that in the next round. So, Bill, I mean, you might want to come back on what Costas has said and say what you think of the program that he has laid out.
Yeah.
But also you've had some specific questions. So there's obviously a lot of your fans are in tonight, and they are curious as to, I guess they're frustrated. What's it going to take for MMT to break through in Europe? How is that going to happen, through what process? There's a couple of questions there from David and Chester. And then there were quite a lot of questions and comments about your comments on a working class movement. So John Worm asks, how do we actually do this? Simon Cohen has said that Brexit wasn't about a working class movement because the working class is actually very divided. And there's a lot of kind of anger within the working class towards so-called benefit scroungers and so on. Tim Pendry asks, really, is it possible to reunite the two factions of the working class that you talk about, given that they're so at odds with one another, as we've seen over Brexit? Would it not be better to simply say, look, the coalition that used to sustain the Labour Party is finished, let's just split off and create a proper socialist party that represents working class interests? And Danny Nicol also expresses skepticism, saying that if the working class interest was really to be prioritised, then you would have to have an agenda of democratic socialism. For Costas, there's a few questions here about what would an industrial policy or a Green New Deal look like. I mean, you were getting onto that at the end, but maybe you want to say something a bit more in more depth about that. There was a question from Patricia Pino about what you think the future of the EU is going to be, which is a very interesting question. The EU, neither of you really mentioned the EU's response to the crisis, but after a long time, they've basically abandoned a lot of their state aid rules, their deficit rules, at least in the short term. The question there is this going to be a long-term shift? Or are they going to try and go back to constitutional neoliberalism? And then finally, for Costas, there's some questions, I assume, from the MMT crowd. Why are you talking about borrowing? Because the state doesn't need to borrow, it can just print its own money. You also mentioned taxing the rich. Is that even necessary? Another question. So I'll come to Bill first.
Okay, thanks. I'll respond to the questions and then I'll briefly respond to some of the things that Costas said, which I found very interesting. Look, I'm aware of this argument about Brexit not being a working class voice. I dispute that, and I made it clear in my brief introduction that while there's an anti-establishment revolt going on, it's quite clear that the people haven't really necessarily put together a coherent explanation of what's causing them harm. They know harm is being caused by the system, but they may not, and they obviously don't necessarily put all the pieces together. So sure, the working class is extremely divided. It's been divided by sophisticated framing and language perpetrated by the elites. Divide and conquer, that's a classic strategy, and that's happened. And it's happened all around the world. And in Australia, the working class turns on itself all the time and criticises people who are unemployed as dole bludgers and all the rest of it. We know all of that. But the point is that the voice that they cast in their vote, which was really the only voice that they had left, given how disenfranchised the neoliberal era has made them, that voice was very clear. And it was unified. They wanted out, the majority. So that'd be my response there. We debate all the time in Australia whether the Labor Party is a viable institution to take forward a working class voice and a political change. And my view on that is that the Labor Party in Australia is incapable of doing that. Its institutional structure is so riven with contradictions, and effectively they are a neoliberal voice themselves. And my, you know, I study the British situation fairly closely. I think it's the same there. The institutional structure is not capable of reform. And I think that's why Chris Williamson, for example, is talking about creating a new festival of resistance, a new grassroots movement, which I think is to be supported. And I think that's the only way forward, a new institutional structure in the political voice. In terms of whether the EU has a future, last night I gave a talk into Switzerland, and that was a topic. People are wanting to know what the future of the EU is. And my view on that is that despite the DNA of the whole thing, it'll be very difficult for them to go back to the Stability and Growth Pact, to the Fiscal Compact. The whole system now floats, and it has floated since the Security Markets Program came in May 2010. And then that morphed into another asset purchasing price program that saved Italy in June 2012 from insolvency. The whole system is floating and remaining intact purely because the European Central Bank is violating the treaty rules and effectively bailing out governments. Now, they're saying they're not, they're saying it's all to do with liquidity stuff. That's just smoke and mirrors. Anyone who knows anything knows that's smoke and mirrors. And so, you know, you've got this situation where the treaty's really becoming irrelevant. And it's sort of like a train wreck that they can't stop, but they are working around it. And I think there's no way they can go back to enforcement of the excessive deficit mechanism. And, you know, you see it, Olivier Blanchard, former IMF chief economist, was in Europe last week advocating a alteration of the fiscal rules. And so how that translates, how that moves into the future is anyone's guess. But my estimation is that they can't go back to where they were. And if they can't go back to where they were, the very rationale of their system as expressed in their treaty alters. What happens there? Now, just a few comments in relation to what Costas said, and by and large, I agreed with the summation. The nation state is very powerful, and the challenge for us as progressive people is to reclaim it and garner it and for our use, and not to be used against us, which it has for several decades. But where I would depart is that I disagree about lockdowns. We've virtually eliminated the virus in Australia through lockdown, harsh lockdown. And we now worry if there's 3 or 4 cases. There were 12 or 13 cases yesterday, I think, nationwide. And the Australian population is 2.5 times, the English population is only 2.5 times our population. Lockdowns are the only way you can stop it and get back. And we're now starting to get back to a sort of a normal, even though our external border won't open anytime soon. We're much more freedom now as the lockdowns ease. The problem with the lockdowns is the problem of all of the policy structures. They're class oriented, and the government could have stopped the inequities of the lockdown if it wanted to. If I was in charge, the underprivileged I would have had them doing well out of this, and the guaranteed wages and all the rest of it. And so the lockdowns are the only way you can deal with the virus, in my view. And then once you suppress the virus, then you have to have a series of other measures elaborate contact and trace and all of that. Once you get the virus at thousands a day, you can't do contact tracing very effectively. You run out of control. In terms of basic income, I'm an avowed enemy of basic income. It's neoliberalism, it's individualism, it's turning individuals into consumption units, and all the rest of the criticisms that I've made over the 25 years. But it may be just a matter of terminology here. I wouldn't call it basic income, but clearly I would guarantee incomes at the moment for all workers who are disadvantaged by the need for society to take defensive actions against the virus. So I support lockdowns, but I also support economic policies that insulate the economic damage of that for the working class. So whether you want to call that a basic income or not, I don't call it a basic income, and I wouldn't institutionalise that terminology as a left person, but I would make sure that workers' wages were protected throughout the period we need to stop people working and interacting. The two other points, tax the rich, I really get, well, I don't want to be incensed at 7:30 in the morning, but the idea that we've got to tax the rich to fund public services really is one of the problems that the left has to get rid of, has to deal with. We need to tax the rich because we want them to have less power, less ability to buy, less ability to lobby, less ability to buy real estate and crowd out less high income workers and all the rest of those reasons. That's why we need to tax the rich. We don't want to have a framing and a language that says we rely on the rich to fund public services. That's one of the things that the neoliberals have successfully been able to instill in our psyche. It's plain wrong, and we don't want to fall into that, in my view. And similarly, we don't want to fall into the view that we need to issue more debt to provide public services and to fund green transitions and nationalisations and all the rest of it. The reality is that the Bank of England is buying up most of the debt anyway in Britain and elsewhere. Even in Australia, the Reserve Bank is now starting to buy government debt for the first time in this period. And so what's effectively happening is that they're funding the deficits anyway without the private debt machinery. So why do we want to, as progressives, continue that thing? Because it'll be turned against us again. The reason why debt is so pronounced in our psyche is because they know the right know they can use that anytime they want to batter down governments who want to do progressive fiscal initiatives. We should be out there educating people that the Bank of England is funding the British government deficits directly. They're doing it indirectly through the secondary bond market, but effectively it's no different. So why would we fall into that rhetoric, the neoliberal rhetoric that's always used against progressive people? Okay, I didn't really get angry. Thank you.
Costas, do you want to come in?
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah. I didn't really want this to become a debate on MMT, but it looks like we're going to be drawn into it. So let me say at the outset that I agree with much of what the MMT has has put forth, but there are things that are deeply problematic with it. And those who want to follow this, then they can read the special issue of the Japanese Political Economy Journal, in which Bill and I and several others will have articles in which we will discuss the MMT and how it stands. My own position is Marxist. I agree with considerable amounts of the monetary analysis. In fact, Marxist analysis of credit money and so on predates the MMT by a long time. But there are issues that are deeply problematic with it, and some of them I'll mention. But let me start with the EU. The EU has changed substantially the last little while since the Eurozone crisis has been changing progressively, but the coronavirus shock accelerated it. And what's been happening is that the nation state has emerged even more powerfully within the EU and even within the EMU. The thing that I mentioned previously about the nation state emerging as something with colossal power is very evident in the EU as well, in which, far from what EU supporters imagine, what we see the last few months is not a restatement and a reassertion of federalism, but the opposite. Actually, nation states have emerged as defenders of their own interests even more strongly than before. In that context, the EU has actually significantly loosened the framework within which nation states have operated, which was a hegemonic framework, ensuring dominance of German industrial capital and dominance of German interests, primarily in the EU. That we can see in terms of the Stability and Growth Pact, which has been suspended, and it will be very difficult to go back to it indeed. We can see it in terms of state aid, which is even more important, and more important for Britain as well, because state aid regulations have been suspended and control of competition has been suspended. The power that's taken most advantage of this so far is, of course, Germany, which has proceeded to support its industries in an unprecedented way since the outbreak of coronavirus, and it will actually enhance its hegemonic position in the economy of the EU as a result of what's happening now. But nonetheless, state aid has been loosened, and Britain should use that argument. And that is also very important in terms of Brexit and what will happen in the next year. That still is an issue because the state aid part of the withdrawal agreement is not good for Britain. Johnson is right on this one, wanting to relax it and wanting to create more opportunity for industrial policy and intervention in order to develop the areas of the secondary sector in which Britain has an advantage. And let's go back to the EU. The other element that shows how it's transformed is, of course, the Next Generation EU program, which was introduced a couple of months ago, and in which we've seen the Commission borrowing jointly, and then instituting a program of essentially of fiscal transfers. Now, it's not nearly as big as these people are making out. It's clear. It's not nearly as big as they're making out. And it's not going to be a bonanza for Spain or for Greece and so on. But nonetheless, it's not what we've been used to seeing from the EU. These are responses by the hegemonic states to a situation that had become unmanageable for the periphery because of coronavirus. They're pragmatic responses, and they basically show that the European Union, and in particular the European Monetary Union, has lost any kind of rules-based management. Remember, the euro began as a strictly rules-based framework. It was supposed to be something with very rigid rules, and it operated like that in a way. Where are they? Where are these rules now? I mean, it just works on the basis of coalitions of forces that decide what's going to happen, and then depending on the balance, they move along. That's the reality of the EU, and that's how it's going to be. This isn't something that will sustain itself for very long, certainly not in any important way ahead. Now let me come to a number of things on the lockdown and on basic income and tax. I'm afraid, Bill, you're 7 months out of date on the lockdown. In March this year, there was a strong argument for lockdowns, I could see, because they didn't know what the disease was. The privatized health systems or the unprepared health systems were not up to it. There should have been reserves. The states should have been able to deal with the shock like that far more effectively than they were, the nation states, but they weren't. So lockdowns, there was an argument for them. I could see, and they did. They imposed lockdowns, and depending on the nature of the state, the lockdowns were more or less successful. So there's an argument here that the Chinese state, with the help of the Communist Party, which is not being discussed, which is not a real Communist Party, but it's a massive parastatal social organization, was capable of imposing lockdowns and effectively scotch the disease. China has a negligible number of cases, if you believe what they say, and I don't think they lie on this. That's not where we are in Europe. In Europe, they botched it. They botched it terribly. It had to do with the class nature of their responses, and the same in the United States. It became very clear that the lockdowns and the disease affected the poor far more than anybody else. This is a disease that kills people with underlying health conditions, heart conditions, blood, and so on. They're the poor that suffer from this. And the lockdown affected and worsened the outlook. During that period, since March, medicine has become far more capable and knows how to deal with the disease. Part of the reason why the mortality is lower is, of course, it hits the younger people now, but also they know how to better how to confront it. In that context, lockdowns were not a policy that the left should have advocated, because obviously the poor know that it hits them. There are conditions of civil unrest in Italy at the moment to do with this. And in Spain, where people are reacting against it rightly, in my opinion, because they know that they're going to suffer from it. Different things were required by states that would have caught the disease in ways that we know much more about. Now, you might say we're in the midst of a mess now. Of course we are, yeah. But that still doesn't mean that we're in favor of lockdowns. That we should take the blame onto the Boris Johnsons of this world. I have allowed 25 and more thousand cases to emerge on a daily basis. So that much then about lockdowns and what the position of the left should be on that. Which takes me to basic income. I said basic income is something that I was very, very skeptical about for good reasons. It isn't all neoliberal. There are also positions that are supported by trade unions, by the ILO, by various parts of the left, but of course there are straightforward neoliberal positions on that. But extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. You can call it something else if you like. We can call it a pandemic basic income or a pandemic support or whatever it is. But there is clearly need for extraordinary help for the poor and for the working class right now, because the coming period will be very tough. And there are arguments that this would act in a Keynesian way to support aggregate demand and to allow the economy to cope with the shock of the pandemic much better than before. We need arguments and we need policies that will apply now, in the here and now. What will happen in the longer term, we will see on that. And finally, let me say something about tax and money. And of course, that's the difference with MMT. The MMT overstates its case on this. It is clear that the state can create fiat money through the central bank, particularly because that fiat money is not convertible into anything of value. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971-73 has ushered in a period in which central banks are capable of creating liabilities convertible into nothing in ways that we've never known in the history of capitalism. And therefore, that allows for the financing of public expenditure. It's perfectly possible. The central bank, in doing that, will acquire some kind of assets. These would be very often public debts. So what we've witnessed the last few months is a right jump of public debt in the United States and in this country, matching the lengthening of the liability side of the central bank. These are financing steps. Financing steps. These are not resource steps. Financing is the first step in this. There has to be another step whereby the resources will be generated out of which the state can legitimate what it does. The state obtains the resources through taxing. The state doesn't produce value. It doesn't produce output. The state claims other people's output and other people's value, and it does so through tax. There will come a moment of tax, and we know that. When the pandemic is over, these people will come back, the government, Boris Johnson, the IMF, and others, and we'll talk about balancing the books. And they will want to impose austerity, and they will want to impose pressure on working people and so on. That is the moment when the left ought to be arguing for tax to be imposed on the rich, on wealth, and so on, to provide the resources, to shift the resources from those who claim them excessively, and so on, to those who need them to confront coronavirus and the shock that it has generated. The left should also take that opportunity to push forward and forth the argument of stronger tax reform in order to reverse inequality. Tax isn't just punishment, and it isn't something we do because we want to create a different world between the poor and the rich. We do want to do that, but it's something that removes resources in this and shifts them about in society. The left is right to think of progressive taxation and to support policies that have to do with altering the tax regime and advocating profound tax reform. That's what we need. And the moment will come in at which we will have to push for it from the position of the left.
Thanks, Costas. Can I come out to Phil Mullen, please?
Hi. Thanks very much, Lee. Thanks very much to Bill and Costas for those comments. I wanted to make a comment and question about the type of state economic policies that we need, and given that both Bill and Costas called for the need for a whether education or a debate about what we need, I would suggest that it might be more useful that we have that debate, not just tonight, but beyond, more on the sort of the quality of what the state needs to do, rather than get too caught up on the, what I would say are the more quantitative aspects of state intervention, you know, where the money comes from, whether it's taxes or borrowing or printing the money or whatever. Because I think we've got a very big problem in the type of state intervention that has been the norm over the last 30 years or so, and which now that we've had this rehabilitation of state activism within official circles, within the IMF and the various central banks and so on, that there is a risk that the sort of state intervention we've had so far will be simply amplified and continued. Because it seems to me we're at a crossroads in that we can have more of the same, and that same has been not a retreat of the state, but the state has been intervening more and more over the last 30 years to prop up the existing economy. That may not have been the conscious intent, but by emphasizing stabilization, which has been the common perspective from Western governments, by emphasizing stabilization, it's been a matter of propping up what has been an increasingly dysfunctional, weak, languid and decaying economy. So it's been propping up businesses, at the same time propping up and maintaining employment, but very low quality, very low productivity, very low paid and insecure employment. But it's been propping up what has effectively been a depressed, dysfunctional economy. So I think we need to recognize that we are at a potential crossroads here, that there can be just more of the same of that type of preservationist state policy, or we need to be having a debate about a very different type of state intervention, one which shakes the economy up, which recognizes that there needs to be new businesses, new sectors created with state help, but it'll be through private investment as well, in order to create the sort of productivity growth and jobs that we need in the future. So I would just conclude by saying I think the focus we should have is on the quality of intervention, whether it's intervention which is transformational versus the record of intervention which has been entirely preservationist and propping up a very poor and dysfunctional economy.
Thanks, Phil. And actually, there's some points in the Q&A very similar to this from Michael Owens. How would we ensure that more state intervention doesn't just prop up zombie firms? And also, Michael points out that the neoliberal state has been regulatory, and it simply doesn't have the capacity to do the kinds of things that you're talking about. I think we've certainly seen that over the last 6 months or so, the lack of state capacity, the dependence of the British state on management consultancies and outsourcing firms is a real sight to behold. So don't we need a different kind of state to do the kinds of things you're talking about, and a very different kind of intervention. And then I'm going to bring together as many of the kind of big questions as I can, although we don't have very much time left because we are going to wrap up at 9:30. So a few people have asked, what do you think the Conservative government is actually going to do? Because there is going to be no election until 2024. It's not really the left that's going to be calling the shots, is it? It will be the Conservatives. And so what are they actually going to do? Alternatively, if you want to take a more optimistic line, as someone says in the Q&A, the lockdown is demobilizing. So what would a mobilized response look like? Is there a way of mobilizing people for a more progressive response? Could UBI really be a temporary measure? Because wouldn't it be very difficult to roll back from that? And then finally, one very persistent person keeps asking about China. China is the actually existing manifestation of state capitalism. So isn't that the future, really, not modern monetary theory, they ask? There's one other person who was asked to come forward, whose name appears to be Ona, but I assume that is not in fact their name. Ona, I'm inviting you to unmute and ask your question. No, apparently not. So let's go back to the panel for closing remarks. You've got about 5 minutes each. Bill, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you. Just on this question of whether the co-option of the state was conscious or not, it was very conscious. It was a plan. Go back to 1971 with the Power Manifesto in the US. It was a strategic shift in the way in which the corporate sector decided to address what they saw as a problem of profit squeeze. This was the big debate in the early 70s. They constructed social democracy and the gains made from welfare states and full employment in terms of profit squeeze. That's the only way they could see it, not in societal terms. So it was a conscious attempt. I mean, the state didn't go away, as Costas said. The state was reconfigured. Previous, in the full employment eras after the war, the state was a mediator in the class conflict. It certainly helped capital, but it also moderated the problems that capital caused for labour But after that period, in the neoliberal period, the state has become an agent of capital, and that's what the fight's got to be about. I just wanted to respond to Costas a little bit about tax, and look, I think we agree. I think we might just have terminological differences, because when you started, Costas, talking about resource shifts, that's not dollar shifts, it's resource shifts, then we're on the same page. We certainly want to have more resources in the hands of the less advantaged and less resources at the disposal of the top end of the distribution. And taxes definitely one way to do that, to reduce their command on resources. But I resist the idea that we need to frame that in terms of funding the ability of governments to redistribute those resources. I don't agree with that, but definitely, if we're talking in resource terms, I agree. We're fundamentally in agreement. And the last thing I'll briefly say is that the neoliberal period has successfully hollowed out the state, and the state has become a contract brokerage in a sense. And you know, in the early days of the GFC, when the Australian government introduced a massive fiscal stimulus, there were also, and it was expressed in the form of insulation for all homes and school halls for all schools that didn't have them, assembly halls, places where you could do drama, etc., music. And there were all sorts of hiccups in the implementation of that very rapidly initiated program. And one of the reasons was that the state had hollowed out all of its machinery to do large projects of that type. And that's one of the things that we need to reinvigorate within our state structures, that as part of the bringing back of outsourcing and nationalisation and undoing all of that, we need to restructure the state so that it has those capacities, and they're not just contract brokers. And so that's final statement. Thanks very much for having me, and thanks, Costas, for very nice interaction.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was an interesting interaction, interesting discussion. Just 2 or 3 quick points in relation to issues raised by the participants in the panel. First of all, quickly on UBI or pandemic basic income. It could be a temporary policy measure. We've done some work on Spain. I hope to get it published soon. I don't mind sticking my neck out on these issues. I know that there will be a lot of left-wing skepticism, which I share, but extraordinary times call for extraordinary decisions. And it is possible to do it for a better off country like Spain, even peripheral in Europe. It's perfectly possible, and the sums, some simple simulations that we've done, the sums are perfectly manageable for a discrete period of time. It is up to society subsequently to discuss how to take it forward and what to do. But at the moment, there'll be children in this country that will go hungry this Christmas. We need action, and that action can take a variety of forms. We need fresh ideas. So that's something I'd like to put on the table for discussion. But the real question here is to do with the state and how to deal with it. And in a way, the MMT is about that. It's about the state. The state is enormously powerful, as I said, colossally powerful. But I did say quickly, although I didn't develop it, it's also weak. What we've seen is the phenomenal power of the state the last few months, together with its weakness. It's never been more powerful than this. He can shut down entire countries. Macron has just shut down France again, just like that. Or at least he attempts to. He's attempting to do it. The state can expand aggregate demand in unprecedented ways, just in a matter of days or months. And he can intervene in production and disrupt production chains across the world. At the same time, it seems to be an alliance of, as has been pointed out, an alliance of consultants, various other firms who are attached to it and make money, various other private outfits that deliver terrible services and profit from it, and so on. Yeah, that is the reality of the state today. That state cannot deliver the industrial policy that I mentioned in my talk. It cannot do it. It cannot do it because what we're talking about here is rebalancing the British economy, changing the structure and the balance between the tertiary, secondary, and the primary sector in this country. That requires capabilities that the state has lost, and it's lost them consciously. In China, it seems to have them still, and that's what makes it interesting. And it allows us to compare Chinese capitalism, because that's what it is, with Western capitalism. State capacity appears to be a significant difference. But in this country, in Britain, we certainly need to intervene in the state. The state is contested terrain. The state is not simply the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, as someone said a long time ago, but it is contested terrain. And it is for us to intervene. It is for us to shape it in ways that we wish it to move and win that struggle, and then push it in the direction that we want it to go in society. That also involves democracy, which is why I mentioned it in my talk. Democracy is fundamental in this. Without democracy, we won't be able to intervene in the state. And what's happening in the field of democracy the last few months is scary, because the connection between this colossally powerful and hollow state at once with the very powerful monopolists that have become even more powerful in the course of coronavirus is frightening. I mean, the ability to police and to intervene and so on doesn't go well. So we need to intervene in those ways, and that is a foundation, a political foundation for delivering the industrial strategy we need to deliver. Who's going to do it? What will be the agency? Well, the problem of the left that has become very clear the last 10 years. We've had two instances in Europe, one in Greece with Syriza and one in this country with the Labour Party. On both, the left bodged it. Both these failures were tremendous in different ways, but also in similar ways. We need fresh ideas. We need fresh organizational mechanisms. We need new people, and we need the young to come forth and begin to play their role in reorganizing the left, because the old is now exhausted. It's clear. In terms of organizational abilities and so on, the left in Europe is finished. That's the debate we need to be having. Easy arguments, though, about let's start creating the new left, sort of body, or the new left party in Britain won't cut it. Creating parties is a difficult thing. We need a debate at this moment. We need the process through which we will find ways of organizing to deliver these changes, to disrupt and reverse financialized and globalized capitalism. We need a debate, and we need to have that debate urgently. And what we're doing now, today, is part and parcel of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everybody that has asked questions. We have got through, I think, about 30 questions, but that's quite good in the space of an hour and a half. I'm sorry to those of you that I couldn't get to your questions, but I hope you're not too disgruntled. Special thanks to Costas and to Bill, especially for getting up so early in the morning to join us all the way from Australia. I suppose I just want to leave you with one thought, which is the left, as Costas has said, is in a terrible state, but we shouldn't overestimate the strength, power, and organization of the right either. At the beginning of this crisis, it looked like the Conservative government in the UK was enormously empowered. It had risen to an 80-seat majority in December and appeared to have enormous authority, surging support in the polls, and total command over the state and its resources. And what have they done with that? They've played by the traditional Tory approach of outsourcing everything to the private sector. Their approval rating has gone right back down. They're behind now in the polls. And what was the big idea for economic policy? I remember listening to Rishi Sunak's speech in early June, was it? And he said, now we're going to do something which has never been tried before. And I thought, is he going to announce universal basic income? No, he announced the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. That's the scale of vision and ambition on the right. Despite everything that they've been forced to do by the pandemic, they don't have any ideas on how to take the country forward. So there are going to be ideas that transform the economy. They'll have to come from somewhere else. And I hope that tonight's event is just the start of many conversations about providing those ideas and forms of inspiration and mobilization. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. This recording will go up on YouTube, of course. So please follow TF Brexit on Twitter to find out when it will be posted. Thank you very much.